So digital assets have been around for more than a decade now, and yet government policy and regulation around crypto is still in its early days. It's fragmented, it varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, and as a result, adoption remains limited. It was one of the points that Kevin here made repeatedly on a panel that we hosted this morning. So we're here to talk about whether and how governments should develop policies around crypto and what that should look like. I would like, if you'll allow me, to do this sort of in three parts. And just first, I want to understand the current state of play for you from your perspectives. Then, sort of in an ideal world, what you're looking for, and hopefully we can sort of hash out some solutions. Is there any way to get to where we want to get to with both sides happy? Will compromises have to be made, and so on and so forth. So let's start with sort of the current state of play in terms of regulation, where we are at. I'd like to put that to those working in crypto first. If you're a crypto organization, sort of what's the current landscape for you? How are you navigating everything? Who would like to speak first?
So, pleasure to meet everyone. I'm Akbar Shamji, and that makes me the CEO of BitZero Blockchain, which is a very focused ESG-driven data center and Bitcoin mining business. To go directly to your point, over the last few years, we've had to pivot dramatically on more than one occasion when government policy has not given clarity. And that's obviously cost resources, but it's also cost the host government in terms of deployment of capital, job creation, and all the things we bring. And I think the sort of playful government view of crypto, that it's a loose idea and policy will follow in due course, is simply inappropriate right now with specific reference to energy and climate. So I think a forum of this nature to bring some cohesive urgency to the energy policy around crypto is very welcome.
Can I just ask sort of which jurisdictions you operate in, and perhaps for some more details on how sort of that pivot took place?
Yeah,
and why?
sure. Happy to. So we're principally located in Norway now. And that's a very unique ecosystem because the Norwegian government in the 50s and 60s built an extraordinary volume of installed hydro, which they don't fully use. We did have to put in the best part of 2 years of electrical engineering to bring that trapped hydro down to the ground, but it's now giving us a very kind of clear and visible runway. And I think that interaction between private sector and public sector, where public sector are deploying capital in huge quantities towards their 2030, 2040, 2050 net zero targets, and sort of private sector is losing it by kind of non-essential use that's denying a lot of other people within the fabric of main society access to renewable energy. So I think there was a very interesting talk earlier from the strategy professor at Warwick, talking about public-private cooperation in a number of areas. And I think the pace at which clean energy can be brought in to use when that dialogue is good and open will be great for everyone. In terms of other jurisdictions, we're now rapidly moving into North America and Canada. Possibly Brazil. Yeah, we're expanding.
Got it. Over to you.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, World Government Summit, for having us here. It's a pleasure to be here. Tim Grant, Head of Europe, Middle East and Africa for Galaxy Digital. We're a publicly listed global institutional crypto financial services company. I'd love to frame this because it's very easy to get, and I've been doing this for 7 years. I know that many have been doing it longer, but 7 years is not bad in this world. And I've had the pleasure of working with a lot of governments and central banks around the world over those years in lots of different capacities. One of the dangers of this space is extremism. So when I talk about the private sector, which is our client base at Galaxy, I always describe the current marketplace as one that's very broad. There isn't a segment that doesn't want to engage in this. It's all the way from retail, high net worth, crypto-native hedge funds, of course, but then traditional funds, sovereign wealth funds, pension funds, endowments, corporate treasuries, you name it, they want to get involved in this space. But here's the thing, in every one of those client segments, there's a very broad spectrum of adoption. There are the progressives who are already trading or already committing capital, who are already in the space, who've made acquisitions, who've gotten into the frame of mind and the mindset required to do it. And there are those that simply cannot get there. It could be that they have the wrong information, they're badly educated, it could be that they had bad experiences, it could be that they're still stuck in the Wild West of 2017 and they think crypto is about ICOs. But there's always that spectrum. And so now turning from the private to the public sector, when we talk about governments, when we talk about central banks, the same rule applies. There's the same spectrum of adoption, and there are those who are particularly progressive and they understand, and I would cite, just as one example, non-biased Switzerland. You know, that's a country where you have the social acceptance, the regulatory acceptance, the political acceptance, and the commercial acceptance that now allows a vast amount of, an oversized amount of activity to occur in a very safe manner. And then you've got plenty of others, and I won't cite any of them, that are at the very other end of the spectrum. So I think that's the important kind of overlay when we talk about this, because if you talk about governments being too slow, I'll give you plenty of examples of governments that have got the joke and are really there, and vice versa. So I think it's really important to kind of state the position or the people we're talking about, rather than making broad generalizations. And I will, one final point, because it's interesting, you in your opening, you mentioned this statement of adoption is limited. And Kevin, I'm not sure if that you attributed it to you. I think that's also an odd statement, right? It sort of introduces a very odd dichotomy that we're in right now at this point in the adoption of crypto. We've come so far. To think of the humble beginnings of this and think of where we are in 2022 and the vast amount of institutional capital, the vast amount of mind share that's taken up in the corridors of industry and corridors of power around the world, and the hundreds of millions of people who are touching this, it's hard to say that there's limited adoption. However, and this is where the balance view matters, it's hard to also say that we don't have an incredibly long journey ahead. We've got to harmonize regulation. We've got pieces of infrastructure that haven't been built yet. There's things we haven't thought of that we're going to have to solve, just like if we were in 2000 and we were looking at Web 2. It's the same story. So the balanced view is this is a rich moment in the history of crypto. Here we all are having this debate in a very grown-up forum, and that's an example of maturity. Sam Bankman-Fried just talked, and hardly anyone in the room. That's a sign of immaturity. He's one of the most important people on the planet when it comes to this, and hardly anyone thought to turn up and see him. Therein lies a massive dichotomy, and that's kind of the world we're in. It's important to be balanced.
I'd like to go back at that adoption issue, because it was I who said that. Here are the facts. You are right. There's tremendous mind share around crypto and its potential. And at the end of the day, all of this is just software. So if you're a believer in Microsoft as a stock and you own Google, you should own crypto. It's all the same stuff. It's just software. But here's the problem. It really isn't being indexed anywhere. And the real money on earth is sitting in pension and sovereign funds where assets get indexed. And so if you're running a $100 billion mandate, a $200 million, a $300 trillion mandate, which actually exists right in this country, 0 Bitcoin on it. That was back in 2017, and it's the same thing today. And the reason that's the case is that the regulator hasn't ruled. And what these institutions have been trying to do to index to the volatility of Bitcoin and crypto is own the equities of public Bitcoin mining companies, which was a good strategy for a while until the ESG mandate came out of BlackRock, and that has reversed that almost completely. And so it's back in the hands of high net worth individuals, family offices, hedge funds, and yet the tremendous opportunity for people at this table and this conference and governments is when this regulation happens, and I'd argue a more advanced government than even Switzerland is Canada, where they allowed the very first Bitcoin ETF and watched billions roll into that ETF in hours, and then an ETF for Ethereum, and then the very first crypto exchange with a dealer broker attached to it through an order of the OSC, and the guy that runs that is sitting right here. He was the first. He negotiated that over 3 years with the regulator. The whole point is, if it gets regulated and it's approved, then this vision of, and after all, Bitcoin's less than $1 trillion, and I don't want to diss that. That is a nothing burger in the context of sovereign assets. That's nothing. And so the potential is that it could become a real asset one day in the sense that it's $100 trillion or something of meaningful size if governments regulate. That's all I was trying to say. And I'm an investor in this space, and a frustrated one, because the policy is so inconsistent and I can't go offside. I can never own an asset that is offside with a regulator because all the rest of my assets have to be regulated, and I can't ever afford to be charged offside by any regulator. So that's why I'm participating here today. I'm saying, regulators, get your poo-poo together. Let's go.
I'm just wondering whether can I just jump in on that front. I'm Richard Teng from Binance, Regional Head of MENA region. I'm my colleague Helen, who looks after many of the different functions in Binance as well. So I spent 28 years as a regulator before I joined Binance. So I think I can try to map out the regulatory framework that you see today. There are challenges, plenty of them. 1/3 of global regulators today regulate crypto, another 2/3 do not regulate cryptos as it stands, right? So I think that's one dimension to look at the issue. Secondly, in many different jurisdictions, you have multiple regulators at play, right? So sometimes you have your central bank, you have your Securities Commission, Commodities Commission at play. If you look at the states, that's what's happening. There's no harmonization. There's plenty of overlap between the regulators. They cannot quite decide who exactly should be the lead agency to regulate crypto, which is a key problem. Also, the definition of crypto is another key problem, right? Is it a commodity? Is it a security? Is it a payment token? So I agree on that front. Firstly, from a global landscape, we do need, from a regulatory dimension, to come to a consensus of how to best define crypto. I applaud what the Dubai government has done, actually, to say that this is a totally new asset class, crypto. We should regulate them very differently from traditional securities and equities. The dynamics of which are very different, which is what you have done in terms of trying to understand that space very well, and to allow for the likes of crypto exchanges, crypto asset managers, crypto brokers, custody players to be licensed quite differently in that space, quite different from what they force feed into the traditional securities front. Having said all those things, the foundational level is the same across regulators today. The key focus is still on KYC, AML, CTF, is still on things like transaction monitoring. So those will become the foundation level that I think all regulators can agree on. And that should be the foundational level that all regulators should start to look at if they wish to start regulating crypto. I think that's the first principle that I think we can all agree on. The second is, in each jurisdiction, we need agreement who is the lead regulator, if there's more than one regulatory agency, to lead efforts in terms of regulating crypto. That's one. To agree at a global level, at a supranational level, how to treat these particular instruments if they have certain characteristics that crypto have. Do we carve it out totally and define like what certain governments have done so now? Crypto is totally different, it's not a security per se. That is another area of dimension that I think as a group we need to start thinking and lobbying and working together on those fronts.
Thank you so much, and I'd like to kind of return in detail to a couple of those. There was a lady over here who started to talk. I don't know if you had anything to add.
Sure. I'm Shira Frank with the MIT Digital Currency Initiative. And it's nice to be with all of you, although I feel like everyone's a little far. So I think a couple things, the frustration I wanted to speak to, I think what we notice at MIT, so we're working in a couple of fronts. Our first front is to work on decentralized networks, and our expertise is specifically in the Bitcoin network and in how to secure the most decentralized networks that exist over the long haul. So that's where a lot of our expertise has been and what we've been doing on the scalability of that network, around its security and around its privacy. But also, since 2015, as technologists, we've been very curious about what is central bank digital currency? What could it be? And not from a theoretical policy question, but actually, how do you build it? What is it? What are the choices and trade-offs of each part, each piece of that architecture? And I think what we've seen that is just kind of everywhere in every government that's come to us, and many do, MIT is a neutral kind of, has expertise. It's interesting. Central banks, of course, haven't had to hire cryptographers and these things over the years. So now that they're facing these policy questions, they're coming to us a lot. So we're seeing from, major central banks and Western banks to central banks in Africa and around the world, that everybody, private sector, public sector, is operating off of tremendously invalidated assumptions about people and about the technology and about definitions. And this feels very risky and kind of the thing that we're focused on the most. Which assumptions are driving choices and are making regulators and policymakers quite uncomfortable that they don't have enough data or don't know what to do? And how can we accelerate actual, hard, intensive technology and social science research to answer some of these questions? So when you asked about landscape, I think that's one of the themes that we think about a lot. Another thing, there's a directional kind of feedback loop thing that's it's often like, oh, we're waiting for regulators, come to us, in the private sector. I actually think technologists, and whether in the private or in the academic sector, need to feed policymakers with data. We need to be doing actual technology building and research, because policymakers really don't know what they want, and they can't even figure out what's possible. The whole range of options with AML and KYC and privacy, it's just every single one of those policy choices will be impacted by the technical design decisions. And that is not at all clear to most of the regulators or policymakers we work with. Canada is one of the more advanced, and the Bank of England, and again, the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston we've been partnering with on the longest. So of course, they're very aware of these trade-offs, but we're at the beginning. Like I can't iterate how early we are, and so far we haven't found people that are any further ahead of us in really understanding the architectural options here. So I just want to add to the relational dynamic, how do we get technologists and technology experimentation, whether funded by the private sector, if the public sector can't fund it to the tune of what it needs, happening so that can inform policymakers to actually understand and be in a safer, more trusting, aware space to make thoughtful, useful decisions. Because I think analyzing the risks right now to their populations, to the economy, is very, very, very difficult to impossible.
Can I just follow up and ask for a bit more detail on those sort of assumptions that you discussed? What do you hear the most, and what have you learned from those?
Oh, so many. Well, let's start with one that maybe will be familiar for people. So assumptions around authorization, right, and access, these are kind of core, right? Issuance of currency, like who's authorizing it and how do accounts, there's this binary that people hear, accounts versus tokens. It is not accounts versus tokens at all when you go down to build these things. It's very, very nuanced about the different small levers you can pull or push for who might have authority to do which part of the process. And a process that might, in our current economy, be 2 actors, we've found could be 5 actors. And each one of those has, that would have a different outcome on how things might work. So I think assumptions of binaries, I think assumptions, again, like around gated access and who could control, the idea that it might be only a 1-tier or a 2-tier system versus something more nuanced. We're looking specifically in our research at digital cash. So can you actually build something that really, really resembles cash, but that is digital? Of course, you'll lose some pieces, but how little could you not lose? Is it possible? And we're doing that in part because it will it's a breakthrough, it's a cutting edge, it's a very difficult thing to do technologically, so it kind of forces you to learn what is and isn't possible. So yeah, there's just privacy, even like who's holding this data and who needs to hold this data and what central banks need to have or not. I think also assumptions on the more decentralized currency front, so getting out of central bank digital currency, huge assumption that, and and please take this with a grain of salt. We're in a closed-door session, so I feel safe to say this. Bitcoin is incredibly secure, and it's also open source software, and not necessarily strategically yet funded, I think, to secure it for the long haul with the right kind of systems in place to tackle really complex monitoring and investigating different kind of potential vulnerabilities in the system. So there's this assumption that it's been fine. Since it's been fine for 10 plus years, it's going to be fine. I think that's a really dangerous assumption. I think we need to harden that network and mature that ecosystem at the technological level just as much as it's been maturing at the financial level. So there's just a couple, but there's many, many more.
Super fascinating. Are there any others? Over to you.
Hi, my name is Helen. I work for Binance. Actually, to go back to your question about current landscape, I would like to summarize. I think crypto is here to stay. But now we're experiencing a very fragmented regulatory environment. The question is actually the government did not figure out the how. And I'm going to elaborate into 3 points. Number one, I think a lot of big government, they're actually taking different kind of position towards crypto. For example, China, it's very clear they want to do their own centralized cryptocurrency. They're not opening up actually for Bitcoin. This is a very clear standard. And then the second thing actually in Europe, I remember actually a few months ago, I was together with CZ meeting President Macron. He basically tapped in the shoulder of CZ saying, we want you to come actually to our country. Why? Because we believe crypto is the big driver for the fourth industrial revolution. We don't want to be left behind. So this is a leader taking a very clear stand in terms of economic transformation. And this is the point I want to talk about, why it's going to be a very fragmented regulatory environment. Let's look at history. Post the Second World War, there are about 200 developing economies globally. Now all the countries actually moved, out into higher middle class income. Only 13 of them actually moved. Why? Because countries are taking different kind of industrialization strategies. In China and Asia Four Tigers, they decided in the second industrial revolution, they decided to opening up, creating millions of jobs for the bottom billion people. That is the jump start of Asia's economic transformation because the policy they took. And then we evolve actually into the third industrial revolution, which is internet-based. If you look at today, the billionaires list, actually the top 10 billionaires, except the owner of Louis Vuitton Group, they are Americans because actually that's the policy they decided took during the third industrial revolution. Now we're in the frontier year of the fourth industrial revolution. If you ask me whether all the countries going to have the understanding, take all the same policy, my answer is not, I can see it. That's because different policy leaders is going to take different kind of stand, and also they have different kind of understanding on this. I remember very clearly, I've been in the industry quite early with Binance. 2018, CZ and I, we were doing an Africa tour, and we met some of the African leaders. And CZ and I trying to convince them, it's actually crypto is good for your country. We're being laughed actually at a conference like this. So that was 2018. Because why? A lot of policy holders, policy makers, they don't even understand what is crypto, and they have the ignorance. They don't want to understand back in that time. But clearly now a situation changed. So one of the things I want to say, we're now actually in a very fast-moving industry. Today, regulator trying to regulate centralized exchange, but there's new things. There's DeFi, there's NFT, there's fan token. If you started regulating centralized exchange, you're pushing a lot of things actually into the DeFi world already. But do you really have the knowledge in the DeFi world? So one of the advice I would say, I think in order for the regulator to regulate in this industry, it's important to get talents in the regulator, team. It's important for actually as a player, when we talk to the regulators, they have the understanding of our industry. Then we can at least have a conversation instead, not an eco conversation. So that's my points. Thank you.
There was the blonde lady here.
Thanks very much, Hannah. So I'm Caroline Malcolm. I head international policy at Chainalysis. Until recently, I set up and ran the global blockchain policy.
Can you speak up a little bit? Yeah.
Thank you. Until recently, I set up and ran the Global Blockchain Policy Centre at the OECD. So I sort of worked with governments all around the world in sort of a spectrum of different areas of the crypto ecosystem and of course blockchain more generally. And I think we can dive into some of the details of, we've seen what's happened with AML, we're seeing what's happening with tax right now in terms of an international tax reporting framework. We're starting to see what's happening in terms of market integrity rules in this space. But I think the sort of common denominator is that we are seeing very much a sort of a copy-paste of what we have in traditional finance trying to be brought over into this world. And I think if that's not the future we want for regulation in this space, then we really need to be investing a lot more as an industry. I mean, I definitely take Helen's point that, I don't think we're going to get to a point where we have sort of global harmonized regulation. That's not the future. It's never been the future in any other area. It's not going to be the future now. But what we do have the opportunity to do is build tools and really work with governments and sort of picking up what Shira was talking about in terms of, collaborating sort of at the technical level, not just about education, although that's obviously incredibly important, but actually kind of showing that using the features of the technology, we can build things which either get to the same or to a better point in terms of policy objective outcomes, rather than just trying to sort of copy paste and sort of tick the box on things like AML. How can we do those things better? I think it's a fantasy to think that those things are not coming to this world, to think that even in the world of DeFi, for example, that's somehow going to be exempt from regulatory requirements. It's simply not the case. So if we do want to shape them, I think we need to go beyond the education work, which I think is obviously very critical, but actually start to build things and demonstrate in a very practical way, working hand in hand with governments in terms of, working together as a team to actually build alternative solutions. Because it's not until we can show in practice that we have better or equivalent outcomes that there's going to be any confidence for them to do things differently. It's simply not the way government is designed. They're not going to take on that risk of trialing something new because we say it will get to a better outcome that will cut down on money laundering by doing it this new way. We're actually going to have to show it through practice, and I think from an industry perspective, that's where a lot of focus needs to be.
Thank you. We've got a couple of people here, so if you take it and then you take the floor, and then we'll go down to the gentleman over there who were asking. Thank you.
Sure, thank you. My name is Najwa Araj. I'm heading the Cryptography Research Center at the Technology Innovation Institute. We're working more on the cryptographic systems, cryptographic primitives, etc. And maybe this is an intervention after what Shirley mentioned, which I completely agree. I think one thing with the cryptocurrencies and crypto systems today in general is that the assumption that we have is that there is an assumption that those blockchain upon which or based on which the cryptocurrencies are deployed are secure by nature. So in my opinion, besides, all the points, the excellent points that were raised before, there should be a big role for regulators to look into the security, the inherent security and the cryptographic structure of all of these blockchain, starting by looking at the different cryptocurrencies, the different blockchain upon which they're based, and then putting together what are the properties from a cryptographic perspective that need to be met. Starting from authentication and key management on the wallet side, the integrity of the blockchain itself, the authentication of users and transactions, and all the other crypto properties that are needed in order to ensure the security of the users and the transactions. And also one good property of blockchain in general is that it gives you some sort of auditability. I think that's what was mentioned before as monitoring. So auditing the transactions, being able to audit them while maintaining pseudonymity of the users is also something that the regulators should work with technologists to put those properties together. The second thing is some of those currencies, they have open source implementations, but today there is not a major effort of security researchers overall to look into vulnerabilities on those blockchain. So the same way that you have CVEs that today they are dedicated to disclosing vulnerabilities in open source software, it is good to start this effort in order to look for vulnerabilities and disclose them in blockchain implementation, whether we're talking about the Bitcoin, whether we're talking about Hyperledger, which is also another open source implementation on other blockchains upon which cryptocurrencies or all the other systems that were mentioned before started being based. So that is my view on, from a technology perspective, how can regulators and policymakers also improve the adoption in a secure way.
Hi, good morning, good afternoon. I'm wondering if I'm the only government official here.
I was going to ask, are there any more policymakers?
Okay, that's good to know.
I'm here as well.
Okay, perfect.
Okay, we've got 3 or 4. I think it's definitely time to hand over the floor to them.
I felt a bit isolated, but okay, that's good to know. So my name is Huda Al-Hashmi. I'm the Deputy Minister for Strategic Affairs at the Cabinet. And the reason why I'm here is because virtual assets is the top of our agenda. And we want to hear and learn from everyone. I think I've been hearing most of the points, and I agree with all of them, to be honest. I think the point that you made was that where does it fit in terms of the regulator? We did have that question mid-year. Is this regulated at the ESC, the Securities and Commodities Authority, or is it regulated at the central bank? And we spent months debating that. And then what we decided was, actually, let's create our own, as dedicated one specifically for that, and hence the Dubai government created the virtual assets regulator. And really that was not to waste any more time, because I think a lot of time has been wasted debating. A lot of time has been wasted understanding where does this belong. I don't think it's still very early days, and like you said, they're probably the primary lead. You still do need to go back to the central bank. You still need to touch base with the others. But at least there's a dedicated regulator who will deeply understand this industry, which is also lacking. I think with digital transformation decades ago, you would sit across government and you would use the buzzword, but nobody would really understand what digital transformation meant. I think we're in that same crossroads right now with crypto. You're sitting across the room with regulators who don't have a deep understanding of this world. And hence, the easy route is to just delay decisions or not make any decisions. The other route is obviously to get in talent who understands this better, involved in the regulation process, co-creating with the industry so that they are able to understand it and catch up. And when we say catch up, of course, regulators are not reactors to what industry wants. They have to protect the good of the nation. But obviously, they cannot do this in isolation. And hence, we had one example of that, and I think this is going to be something that we will continue to do in this industry. The data privacy law was one that was also a huge debate, I think, at least in our government. And how we cracked it is that we worked with the industry, and the industry co-wrote that law with us, and through many series of roundtable discussions. And I think this open dialogue of co-creation for law is something that we're going to be doing more of. The other key thing is principle-based regulation. I think that's another thing that we should look at. I think in the regular standards of regulation is what can you do and what can you not do, and detailing it out. In this industry, you cannot detail out because you don't know what's coming ahead. So I think you need to have a way that we can develop something that is principle-based, but it also has the right metrics in areas. I also want to talk about something that we recently did, because with this world, it's not a world that has borders. It's not a world that has defined regulators. In true, we have our UAE regulations and we have Dubai regulations, but you probably need to have a cross-border regulation if you're in Canada and you want to do business here and so forth. We worked with the OECD and the World Economic Forum to create something called the Agile Nations Network. And the Agile Nations Network is comprised of 7 countries, Canada being one, UK, Denmark, Italy, Japan, and Singapore. And our mandate is to develop regulations that will support cross-border integration and scaling up for markets and businesses. This year, the UAE won the bid to chair this, the Agile Nations. And we won the bid because we put 3 main areas that we wanted to look at. The first one being sharing platform, the second one being the new economy and regulations for virtual assets and crypto. And that got a lot of attention with all the 7 nations. And the third one being, what does metaverse mean for government? So I think this is very early days. We start next week, our bid. But I think the key thing is that we shouldn't look at just our small jurisdictions. We need to look at other jurisdictions of like-minded countries that would embrace new economy rather than fear it. Thank you.
Thank you, and down to the end.
Thank you very much, Murphy. Is it possible to speak French to be more accurate, or there is no translation?
I don't think we have a live translator here.
Okay,
No.
so it will be painful, but I will try. I think regulation is moving, but is moving very slowly in front of the innovation. It's
Pierre, can you introduce yourself before you speak?
Oh yeah, sure. Pierre Persson, I'm the only representative of EU. I'm a French MP. I was the advisor of Emmanuel Macron for his campaign, and nowadays I'm a deputy MP, member of Parliament of Paris at the National Assembly, and I work on crypto assets since my election in 2017. So I'm very critic in regard of the regulator. I'm not schizophrenic, but nowadays I can be happy with the way that we are embrace this technology, and it's normal in certain way because innovation are very fast. You know, when I work on the first framework in Europe, it was in France, legal framework on crypto asset. It was in 2018, and we were working about ICO. Nowadays, there is no more ICO, but there is DEXs, there is stablecoin, and there is new subject. It is the same case with MiCA, market in crypto assets, that is the text in front of the EU Parliament right now. It was drafted in 2020, and it doesn't speak about algorithmic stablecoin because it doesn't exist in 2020. So it is a difficulty to regulate an innovation that is moving very, very fast. So I'm very pleased to be in this configuration because I think there must be more co-production between regulator, legislator, and economic actor, and I don't see that much in Europe, and I'm very afraid because you have a responsibility to educate politicians, and nowadays I consider that there is no education on this kind of subject. It is why 2 weeks ago, EU Parliament want to forbid the proof of work. It's because politician doesn't understand the subject that we can bring some type of regulation that is no sense for me. So we have to speak together more. And after that, I see 3 subjects. The first subject is about banking, DeFi, and KYC, anti-money laundering. We have to find an entrance of the regulation. And the regulations cannot be just on centralized exchange, on centralized operator. Because nowadays I see a translation between the old regulation that is on centralized, because old finance is about centralization, and we are transferring the responsibility to all the centralized actors with the new regulation. So we have to change our view, you have to change our paradigm to embrace this technology and consider that decentralization can be will be the next paradigm. And I think actors like you need to teach to the politicians how to see the future, to go ahead, to go further, to help us to understand this technology. Thank you.
On a tout compris, bien joué.
Sorry. I'm going to put a question out there, but people can ignore my question and say what they wanted to say. I've seen a few people raise their hands, or they can address it. But one thing that I was curious about was sort of whether you think crypto regulation should be sort of carved out, created in addition to existing regulation, or existing regulation should be sort of tweaked and clarified, and what are the benefits and disadvantages of each? Do people want a kind of combination? I know Caroline addressed sort of the copy-paste, so it sounds like there's some negative feelings towards that, but if anyone else has any thoughts, I'm curious.
So I'm Sahia Ahmed. Can you hear me? I'm Sahia Ahmed. I'm with the Dubai Department of Economy and Tourism and part of the core team that has established the Virtual Asset Regulatory Authority in Dubai. So we're already working with a number of you in the room. We are the independent regulator for Dubai for virtual assets. And as Huda mentioned, we worked very closely with the federal government to really understand how this should fit in. And should we be considering putting a layer of regulation over an existing infrastructure, which some jurisdictions have decided to do, and then come to the conclusion that actually we need something independent. We need something that has a fresh eye, both from the perspective of really understanding what the industry needs and wants, because, as you mentioned, the regulators do not have the technical experts. And then secondly, also from building a bridge really between us being the one-stop shop window that is the bridge between the industry and what I would call the traditional regulators, right? So we work very closely with the Securities and Commodities Authority, with the central bank, to make sure that their concerns are addressed, but then we're actually almost translating in between with partnership with industry to build the regulation together, and then to ensure that their concerns, the traditional concerns that you see in most markets, whether they're the politicians' concerns or whether they are the overall economic concerns that you would have, are addressed in the regulation. So that's kind of the first thing that I wanted to mention. The other piece I think we're talking about a lot is how this replicates around other jurisdictions, which is really critical. And I think whether we do that with the Agile Nations Network, and we're seeing that there are some markets that are ahead, some that are still very cautious about how to deal with this. Our perspective on this is you need to be agile. The industry is changing and growing. If we can put something in place and then be sharing that with other regulators so that it is an open space to see how easy it is to either replicate or to be able to passport across jurisdictions. I mean, we have that already. There's an example of that already in Europe, of passporting, to be able to enable that so that it becomes then something that can be used globally.
There are a few hands over this side. Over to you, Sam.
Hi, everyone. My name is Richmond Teo. I'm the co-founder of a company called Paxos. We've been around for about 10 years, and we've always tried to embrace regulation from day one. So you can imagine it's been a pretty tough 10 years. And to your question on whether there should be new set of regulations or working the existing ones, I think that crypto is a lot of things. It's not one asset. And in our experience, we've basically been thought of as, from the early days, as crypto is something that is traded, to crypto as a form of payment, to crypto as a type of security, to crypto as a new type of technology. So I think, for us in the US in 2015, we received a trust license to enable us to bypass money transmitter license requirements, because as you can imagine, in 2013, it was very hard to explain what Bitcoin was to state regulators. So that was one way that particular segment could be bypassed, and we could basically approach crypto trading in a regulated fashion. Later on in 2018, we worked with our regulators then to create a set of frameworks that would safeguard cash reserves and have a strong way to think about how stablecoins can exist. One of our stablecoins, where we are particularly proud of in partnership with Binance, where their concern was safeguarding their customer funds, we have a specific set of regulations that are monitored by the New York Department of Financial Services to ensure that all customer funds are safe and we comply with the appropriate regulations. And as we moved forward towards thinking about crypto more as a national way of trading, a form of payments and all that, we received a national trust charter from federally in the US from the OCC, which enables us to do a lot more and reach US nationally. With regards to technology and thinking about how blockchain can improve things we do, regulation and clearing and settlement, we received a no-action letter from the SEC to clear and settle US equities for the first time outside the DTCC, which is something that we're particularly excited about, and hopefully we can see crypto not just in trading as a payment, but also the technology being used in what we see today. And recently we received our major payments institution license from the MAS in Singapore, and that enables us to do digital payment tokens, to trade and interact with retail customer bases. So I do think that it's ideally there could be one set of laws, configurations that regulators can look at and simply say, hey, do you check this box or not? But I think crypto is a lot of different things in one, and in order to get there faster, maybe it makes sense to think about different boxes in which different types of regulations would make sense to different types of businesses that are being provided. So I think stable coins is one thing that's very interesting. I think Binance is our major partner there. Their concern is client safety, cash safety, and all that, and we ensure that all our reserves are in U.S. Treasuries, which basically gives us roughly the same safety standard as almost a CBDC, and that is held in a bankruptcy remote trust structure. So I think that is one way that we think about providing that particular asset. Similar structure to what Binance's BUSD has is the USDP, which is currently in Meta's Novi wallet. And we work with other companies as well, regulated companies or different institutions who want to enjoy some form of regulatory cover to basically allow crypto trading to their user base. For example, PayPal uses us to enable buying and selling of crypto to their customer base. So as we move forward, I think we've been trying to stay on the forefront. I think there are a lot of different pieces involved, and crypto is a big piece, and we want to make sure that we are not waiting for some new regulation, but trying to engage different parts and different pieces of regulation so that we can move forward as an industry and move forward in a compliant way as an industry.
Was there anyone else who'd raised their hand earlier who wanted to speak? Okay, if we go to you and then over to you after.
Thank you very much, Murphy. My name is Fazli. I'm the CEO of MX Global, the latest licensed exchange in Malaysia, which I would maybe argue is one of the narrower regulatory environments that exist right now. I'm also a recovering DGen, and in a previous life, I was Chief Strategy Officer of a government agency in Malaysia that overlooked policy harmonization across multiple sectors to support digital economy growth. I've heard, I think, various points shared today, and I think we can all agree that cryptocurrency is a very broad spectrum of not just products and services, but also policy considerations. But if I may suggest, from my limited experience and also working in a loose coalition that is ASEAN, which maybe is less structured than the EU, but nonetheless tries to adopt similar policies towards becoming a singular trading bloc. I believe there is a strong argument that we shouldn't use a copy and paste approach. However, as we could very much appreciate, this is a very commercially lucrative sector in cryptocurrency. So as much as I respect Helen's view that practitioners should join regulators and be part of the listening ear on the other side and be the informed, not to say decision makers, but to translate between public sector and private industry, I find it highly unlikely that many of the ones who are doing magnificent things and having great careers in crypto maybe look to migrating to the policy or public sector side. So what we've seen in other industries such as e-commerce and cloud computing before it is that there will more than likely be a copy and paste approach by many governments, especially where the economies are much smaller, and so much more deterministic economies such as the US or the North American economies and Chinese economy. And especially Helen pointed out before, China is moving towards a very progressively centralized approach to cryptocurrencies. They will ultimately lend much influence over how smaller countries adopt it. I come from a country where it is a restricted currency, and I believe the Bahamas is also a restricted currency, and the Chinese one is also restricted. However, them progressing to a tokenized version of their currency, whether a centralized version or not, has very different bearings and ramifications over how other countries will approach it. So if I may suggest, and considering that we're in Dubai and I've been following quite closely the kind of regulatory approach of the region, what I think has to happen has to have three layers. That you essentially need a champion country to adopt policy harmonization on a national level. And I think Richard also brought up before that you have this divergence between central bank, securities or commodities regulators. So that has to be exemplified to a certain degree. And next, you need to have cross-border or friendly nation harmonization of policies. So maybe that may be, in this case, again as an example, Dubai and then the greater UAE membership. And then essentially after that, how that translates to private sector adopting those standards to do cross-border commerce and trade. Now, I also advise a new layer one initiative that's trying to work on a compliant first approach to tokenizing and using blockchain on digital trade. And it's extremely hard, not just because of the issues that we discussed today around cryptocurrencies, but around issues of data protection and data sovereignty, and also then currency sovereignty. So I don't think we should wait, or we cannot even afford to wait to a state where global policies are so harmonized and standardized that we're going to achieve that state. It really has to be led by example by, again, I'd argue, a single country leading into a greater coalition and then exemplifying how private sector can adopt those standards. Because at the end of the day, I would argue that when you can see that the policies work and people can make money and trades can be more efficient, other countries will believe that that system can be adopted and then look at localizing that. So maybe it will be a copy and paste approach, but maybe a copy and paste and edit, a slight edit kind of approach that I think many countries, especially smaller nations, will take. Thank you.
I like that, copy, paste, and edit. Over to the gentleman over here.
Hi, my name is Jason Cao. I'm the COO for Certic. Certic is the largest security service and product provider for the blockchain industry. I am here kind of talk about more on the technology point of view. Regulation is not my area, but I can share some experience that we had that I think regulation maybe help us to really have this kind of industry to grow and have the trust for the community for the mass adoption, right? So I think first of all, I think for government to do any effective regulation, first of all, echo a lot of speakers mentioned before, is they have to have deep understanding. They have to understand exactly how things work. Especially like I'm a technical guy. I'll give you some experience. People are talking about the KYC. We're trying to do KYC for our customer, right? So you need to understand KYC, how it works. But then KYC for projects that organize crypto, it's organized a different way. Some of the project doesn't even have an entity. And how do you verify who is the 10% owner for the interested token? So there's a lot of details you actually need to understand to make it really work. And also people need to have an open-minded about, okay, there's two set of group people. I mean, a lot of government officials, they don't have very deep understanding about the industry. They will associate, okay, crypto, a lot of things, there are a lot of scams, fraudsters, there's a lot of bad things going on. So anything related to crypto, you need to be very suspicious of that. For that, I also have experience. We provide technology services. I try to open an account. Usually our account opening process is much longer than any other business. The only reason is because they said, okay, you deal with crypto. That's the only reason. So what we hope for is we need a regulator to have deep understanding on things really work. Then they can talk about intelligently how to regulate this. And second of all is we are waiting for some certain clarity on usual things. There are certain things I understand will take longer to regulate, have very clear policy, but there's certain things probably it's easier. Let's take small steps, not try to solve all the big problems at once. That will be more effective. And another perspective I want to talk about is, so there are a lot of industry players here. We also probably want to take some initiative ourselves. We cannot hope just, okay, regulator help us solve the problem, right? For example, now one of the key issues I think is kind of having a bad reputation for the industry is a lot of news or media and even government officials have a view that, okay, there's a lot of fraudulent transactions, money laundering, scams related to this industry, which not necessarily true. But on the other hand, can the industry itself come together, do something about it? I think we can. That actually does not necessarily rely on the regulators. For example, we provide security. Do we have a security standard? No. Do we have a lot of hacks? Yes. And do we lose billions of dollars every year? Yes. And then why? There's no standard. I mean, we have a lot of hacks across multiple chains. Why? No standard for the bridge. I think at the industry itself, I think we can come together, try to create some standard ourselves. And for example, if money got hacked, how do you trace it? Now, can the exchange, centralized entity, security service provider come together, form some alliances to help people kind of trace, prosecute scammers, hackers, and put them kind of basically have consequences for their actions, right? That actually can help the industry itself to grow in a more healthy way, and then actually people will have more trust that have mass adoption.
Thank you. I wanted to follow up, and again, feel free to respond to me or make another point. That I see another few hands raised there. But I wanted to follow up on something that you said a little earlier about sort of AML and KYC being the foundation we should all agree on. That's sort of agreed. I don't know if people agree with that, and if so, what should regulation in that space look like? Is there a clear bar? Should it mirror existing financial services, AML, KYC, and sort of is the crypto space ready for that? Over to you, sir.
Hi, I'm Charles Hoskinson, the CEO of Input Output. We build cryptocurrencies and blockchains, and we also do a lot of academic research, and we have a lot of university partnerships. We operate in more than 50 countries. And I can tell you right now, the legacy regulatory structure in itself is horribly fragmented and broken by design, because regulations are usually scoped to nation states. And somewhere along the line, transnational agreements exist, and we try to wire things together. But if you read the Panama Papers, it's very clear that if we take cryptocurrencies out of the equation, the world doesn't do a phenomenal job of harmony. We say, well, what's the basis of, maybe it's AML and KYC. Well, then who do you report it to? Chinese government? European Union? United States of America? I think you have to take a step back and ask yourself, well, what are cryptocurrencies? They have more in favor in many cases with the natural laws of physics than they do with social structures. Do we often talk about how do we regulate gravity? How do we regulate the wind and water? No, these are things you live with, and these are things you design around, and you accept them as axioms of life, and you say, well, what would we want to do to protect ourselves? So there are basic principles behind regulation. For example, consumer protection. And those deal with things like asymmetries of information. So does Bob know more than Alice, and is he going to take advantage of that? You look at things like market stability, usually the concern of the global economy. In 2008, we learned how important that was. But then there's also geopolitical goals in regulation. Let's not forget that. It's the lurking specter that we don't seem to mention from time to time. How many people here feel comfortable doing business with Russia at the moment? Yeah, I didn't think so. Why? Because they're the odd man out in the geopolitical order. So the problem with regulation is it's contradictory at times. The things you may do to benefit the consumer and protect them may hurt market stability. For example, privacy standards. The more you know, the better you can intervene, sooner you can intervene. But the more you know, you may actually hurt the consumer from a privacy perspective. It's the same when you talk about geopolitical goals. Sanctions hurt everyone. They just do. And compliance with those hurt everybody. I started Ethereum with a bunch of kids years ago, and I made the decision to take us to Switzerland. At the time when we went to Switzerland in 2014, there were no crypto standards there. We were the patient zero. We worked with MME partners in Zug, and we went drinking with the mayor of Zug, and we got a tax ruling, and we talked to FINMA, and we said, hey, if we pull this off, like billions of dollars will come to Zug. It'll be great. And they said, well, you know, you kids are crazy. And sure enough, it happened. Go figure. And now Switzerland's crypto mecca. It's amazing. It's a utopia for crypto, alongside Singapore and all these other places. So I think you have to start with what are your goals, and then you have to start with what does your technology give you. A few days ago, I was on my ranch with my bison. Now I'm here in Dubai. My ranch is in Wyoming. Technology allows me to move very quickly to places. And the internet allows information to flow instantaneously. Crypto gives you so much that you've never had before as a regulator. It gives you the ability to blend into the transaction itself, the settlement of the transaction, the capability of complying with something. It gives you the ability to make all regulation open source and global, and make things look like libraries and SDKs and APIs instead of dry policies that aren't machine understandable. In addition to that, you can actually push burdens and responsibilities from central institutions that have to file suspicious activity reports to the edges, the consumers of the systems, and hold people accountable in new ways. So my problem is I've talked to regulators now for over 8 years, and it's often contradictory. It's less than desirable. And what's so frustrating to me is that they keep trying to fit our industry into boxes it doesn't fit into. Crypto is like a stem cell. It can wake up as a currency, it can go to bed as a commodity, it can be security curious on the weekends, it can do all kinds of things. Our regulation systems are not built for this. They're not designed for this. And yes, you can build new systems. We did that in the 90s with the Communications Decency Act and all these other legislation that was passed for the web. And that's not working well in an age of Facebook and Google and data surveillance. It's not working well in an age of Amazon. They all need to be modernized and updated, and you'll end up chasing yourself forever. So I think what we need to do is take a step back and say, well, how did the internet evolve? How do we regulate this amazing thing with billions of people? Is it the ITU that wakes up every day and figures it out? No. There's more to say with the W3C and the IETF and volunteer organizations and governance networks than any regulatory body. And every time a regulatory body's tried to come in and regulate it, they end up turning it into a dystopian nightmare, like the Chinese firewall, and just screw everything up. Instead, you take a step back, in my view, and you say, let's use the technology and be smart about it and build into the system basic principles. If you value consumer protection, build that in. If you value KYC and AML, build capabilities to carry that on the wire and then talk about how one would comply in a particular jurisdiction for that. But don't just go ahead and put everything into an old structure like what Gensler's trying to do with the SEC. Or try to create sandboxes or these other things, because the problem is it's a global system. It's going to escape your sandbox. Just in paying our people. We have employees currently in Russia and employees currently in Ukraine. And we send them crypto, we're in violations of something. and then they send money to somebody, a donation. Maybe they're not. Every transaction touches 25 countries. We're under 25 different regulatory systems. We're like the Schrodinger's cat of regulation. We're both in compliance and out of compliance at the same time upon observation. This is the life. And so I guess concisely, you have to take a step back and realize that this is a different thing and treat it more like gravity, treat it more like the laws of physics, and say what systems do you need to build, accepting that these things exist, and also understand that this is global by default and will always be global by default. No matter what China wants to say and do and try to close themselves off, 40% of all the crypto assets are still there, and they're being managed remotely in Singapore and other places. So they can't shut it down. No one can shut it down. You just have to build around it and treat it like you would a physical thing.
Does anyone want to respond to that? Over to you.
I would like to. Never going to happen. That's my answer. It's financial services, and unfortunately, financial services are essentially the infrastructure of all 11 sectors of the S&P. And it would be impossible, or not impossible, but pragmatically not realistic, to expect regulators anywhere to say, look, we're going to let crypto run ramshot through all sectors of the economy unregulated. I actually agree with you. I really do. It is gravity. I believe it'll become the 12th sector of the economy in the next decade. But I also live in the real world, and I want to get stuff done, and I want to invest. And so I know, in fact, that was a beautifully articulated position on crypto. I think all of us agree with you. But it's now back to reality. So what do we do tomorrow? And I'm here to deal with regulators. That's what I'm doing, and I'm investing heavily in this sector as if it was the 12th sector of the economy. In our operating company, we're at 20% weighting. That's as much as we can put across 32 positions. That's a huge, over 30 months we did that. That's unheard of for us. We're so conservative. But, I want to cry. That was so beautiful, I got to tell you. But it's just not going to happen.
Well, Kevin, this is a great opportunity to make money. So we build systems to protect us from nature. So there's fire services, right? Because fires happen. And so RegTech, building infrastructure on top of the protocols to allow one to comply within a domain, within a geography.
You should get involved with Senator Loomis as she's putting together her, maybe you are, I don't know.
Yeah, I read the bill. It's 142 pages.
I read the bill, but let's just take stock of the 4 vectors of policy that are coming at us right now against your Picasso painting, because that's what it was. Number 1, the POTUS order. Inside of that order is an admission that this is here to stay, agreeing with you, but then it goes into the mandates that are political, notably ESG, the discussion of climate change, which is a direct swipe at data centers and Bitcoin miners around the world. That's number 1 vector. Number 2, the Loomis bill, which contemplates a lot of what you're talking about, but not on NFTs. It's just not in there. So that's a big part of the growing crypto economy. It's just not even contemplated. Number 3, and the scariest one, which just came at us last week, is this concept out of the SEC of a carbon neutrality audit on a quarterly basis. There is, and I immediately called 2 large audit firms and said, would you ever sign that audit? And they said, never. There's no ledger system for offsets in carbon. You can have a Bitcoin mine or a data center or a dirty industry and say, I bought a square kilometer of the Amazon forest and I'm neutral. Everybody knows that's total bullshit. And they're never going to audit that. They're never going to do it. And lastly, and the one that I think is doing the most damage right now, is Larry Fink's mandate on ESG, which he's sweeping around the world and forcing sovereign funds like the one here to stay out of digital currencies because of ESG concerns that can't be measured. So there's more work to be done in terms of getting regulators thinking in your direction, because right now we're going down the 4-vector route. And next week, when the world gathers in Miami for Bitcoin 2022, the number one issue that most Bitcoin miners, and we have one right here, Hade, the CEO, she's going to have to answer to ESG. She's going to have to answer to carbon audits. She's going to have to answer to institutions that are saying, am I compliant or not on that? Because
she already does.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. But you also burn natural gas to get the electricity, so it's going to be a tough discussion. So anyways, I want to go back, and it was just a wonderful moment there. But it's over.
But it's over, and back to Kevin's number one priority, which is ESG and his problem with carbon offsets.
Hi everyone, I'm Jonathan. I'm one of the co-founders of a company called Chainalysis. We, as Caroline outlined, we provide a lot of the monitoring, and someone actually in the last sort of panel like this compared us to the firefighters that Kevin described. So, we provide investigation and compliance software for the industry. And I think just to simplify and exemplify what we mean by concrete results, we have been in business 8 years. We operate in more than 35 countries around the world with government regulators and law enforcement, and have done a tremendous amount of, weeding out bad activity that has been, conducted in cryptocurrency, and ensuring really the two primary sort of concerns that people have, which are, investor protection and public safety. And so when I look at this discussion and what regulators, tend to need to agree on, I say break it down into sort of some of the pieces, and people have been talking about this, but some really simple rules of the road, right? Spot trading. That is a type of activity that can be sort of several of, spot trading in these cryptocurrencies, where, those rules can be made extremely clear, and that can then attract a lot of investment. If you think about futures trading, derivatives trading, again, these are simple activities that we know how to regulate them. We know what that looks like. And so frameworks that, appoint a principal regulator that takes, a proactive approach about how to, have oversight over these activities is going to be a model for the rest of the world. And so I think that when you think about, and again, just take some of the boxes and understand, what are the differences between sort of spot trading Bitcoin and spot trading copper? There's not a whole lot, right? And so, I think that those types of buckets are very useful as you're constructing sort of the regulatory regime and architecture. And then it gets into sort of more complex, forms of this, and you think about payments, and you think about lending protocols and retail versus institutional. It starts to become a richer policy environment where there are these types of trade-offs and there are these things. But there are a lot of things which are just very straightforward. And to the point about creating a model regulatory architecture in a country in sort of the Dubai region and the Emirates more broadly, it is possible to think about those and have these sort of distinct categories and actually, demonstrate to the world that it can be simple and it can be sort of something that businesses will flock to, if that is done correctly. I would say the primary difference when it comes to sort of stablecoins more broadly, lending protocols, payments, transfers, is that there is a degree of transparency. And there's not a need for government to necessarily take a reactive approach. That actually there is the ability to be incredibly proactive in sharing information with the private industry, and also, investigating transactions of concern. And that's definitely something that can also be demonstrated in sort of a geography like this. And I think that that type of strategy where we have a government that's looking out for the key objectives that the government wants to achieve on the public policy side can actually be done very proactively given the transparency of cryptocurrencies. And so, my sort of recommendation is to take the activities that are fairly simple and can correlate back to things that we really do understand. Let's put a principal regulator in the driving seat. Let's take a technology first approach to understanding that data. Let's be very proactive about it, and that sets us up for understanding what is possible for a modern regulator to have a technology enhanced approach to a sector that is actually now quite mature and easy to understand.
I wanted to go back to FIRE, because I really do think we need to spend one more moment and make it a little practical, because I hear what you're saying, Kevin. But I think that I get very frustrated with how ahistoric most crypto conversations and conferences, small or large, are. We actually have the benefit of the internet. We can learn from how that evolved, and I think we must. Not just from the opportunity, but even more so from the risk and harm perspective. This is even more fundamental. I think changing the way money and the protocols of value in general, this is even more fundamental than communication to me, for us as a species and for our world. So I'd be curious what these first principles might be, or what you're imagining, Charles, or if any of the regulators, when you heard that idea of stepping back and getting much wider in your scope, a little bit different than what's been suggested about getting really specific and putting someone in place. I think there's a lot to discuss, the politics of how to organize regulation and all of that. Formerly, I worked on the Iran nuclear deal, so for 8 years of my career, I was in the weeds in the US with policy, but I have to say I left and came to crypto because I thought, political change is quite ineffective at going to the root. We don't have a peace in the Middle East yet, as you all know. So I'd really curious what those first principles might be, or what the process even that you're imagining when you ask that question.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I mean, we ask this every day, which is why we chose a research-driven approach. We've written 131 papers. We have over 10,000 citations in the portfolio, and most of the really good papers that are highly cited are foundational. For example, when we started, we didn't know what the hell a blockchain was. So we wrote the GKL model, and has over 1,200 citations now. Now, what we were chasing were basic things of, for example, equality and fairness. So your access to the system should be the same as mine, should be the same as the shepherd in Senegal. Seems like a good principle. No one should be able to control or co-opt the system. So whatever the initial state of the system happens to be, that social contract that it establishes is held. Then the user should have the ability to verify that property. And that's called inclusive accountability. The easiest way of understanding it is, how many people vote? A lot of people. Are you
qualify
able?
This as decentralized, right?
Well, sure, of course. We'll get to that. That's another basic principle. But we don't even have a good definition of decentralization, which is why we're trying to create one. But we'll get to that in a moment. So inclusive accountability is a property where you're able to verify something yourself. So in a voting system, can you verify your vote was counted? Most systems, no. Can you verify it was counted the way that you voted? No. Can you verify the integrity of the entire system? No. So that system lacks the property of inclusive accountability. Contrast that, for example, with Bitcoin. If I send you a Bitcoin and you have a full node, you can check and verify that that Bitcoin actually exists and it hasn't been double spent. And you can at any time verify the integrity of the entire system, the circulation of all transactions inside the system. So we call that system property inclusive accountability. So in addition to equal access, in addition to egalitarianism, you'd like to have inclusive accountability. And then to Kevin's point, you have this concept of decentralization. The problem there is that for all complex systems to function, biological or artificial, you need heterogeneity, specialization. We have eye cells and brain cells, and equivalently you have institutions, and they allow you to deal with complexity and in changing environments. So the problem with Bitcoin is it's a homogeneous system. It's just full nodes. And the minute you deviate from that, your trust model collapses, your inclusive accountability collapses, and so forth. So the next generation of cryptocurrencies, the third generations in the world, the Tezoses, the Cardanos, the Polkadots, these things, they're chasing preservation of these prior properties of equality and so forth, but they're also trying to make major innovations where they can introduce heterogeneity, but not compromise on decentralization. The problem is we actually don't have a good definition of decentralization. Is it a Gini coefficient? What about meta properties like developers? If only 5 developers maintain it, if the source is not well reviewed, is exactly what the CertiK guys are talking about. These are existential concerns to the system. So you have to have some easy to understand metric. But we're humans, we do these things. We'll remember the processor wars in the 90s. AMD and Intel fighting each other, 1 gigahertz, 1.2 gigahertz. We as consumers were trained to think clock speed was equal to performance. It turned out that there was a much more nuanced way of looking at it, and then 3D Mark and these other systems came out to measure graphics cards and CPUs. So we'll get there as an industry. The other thing, Kevin, you mentioned energy consumption. That was a very valid concern years ago. But if you look at the markets today, almost half of the $2 trillion of value are now in systems that don't really consume a lot of energy. If you look at proof of stake in particular, Cardano, Tezos, any of these systems, they consume usually less energy than this conference center. Bitcoin currently consumes more energy than Ecuador. And actually, if you look at the way these systems are designed, these protocols are designed, as the value of the protocol goes up, they tend to get more decentralized and consume the same amount of energy for their maintenance. Bitcoin, on the other hand, has a perverse energy incentive. As the price of Bitcoin goes up, it gets more centralized because the mining operations verticalize. It's like aircraft manufacturers. You get fewer and fewer of them because it's the economy of scale. And you also have more energy consumption for the system. So what's amazing is in just 13 years, we've gone from 1 protocol to over 8,000 protocols, small amount of nodes to a global, at least 100 million users, and a Darwinianness about technology. These basic principles are not only reflected in prose, but in things like, for example, snarks. You can't possess the full ledger, because if everybody's using it, it becomes petabytes in size. So why don't we create a zero-knowledge proof? And then suddenly, you can still verify things, you can have inclusive accountability, but you only have maybe a megabyte of data, regardless of how big the blockchain gets. Before crypto, the amount of papers published every year for snarks were less than 10. It was a very bespoke area, zero-knowledge cryptography. Now it's hundreds every year. There's millions of dollars of funding going in, and that's just one area. Multi-party computation is another area. Homomorphic encryption is another area. Distributed systems, there's thousands of papers that are now published, reflected by tens of millions of lines of code and an enormous amount of competition. Out of altruism? No. People want to get rich. And anytime you create a Rube Goldberg machine that prints trillions of dollars out of thin air, you attract millions of people all around the world to compete and work on these things. So my only point about policy and regulation is understand that you have this giant incentive engine and it is currently can be steered in any direction. All you policymakers have to do is set the tempo. Tell the industry what you care about, what you want, and where the value is. Give that clarity, and the entrepreneurs will do the rest. RegTech industries like Chainalysis, Elliptic, these other companies, they've been built and they're worth lots of money to give you, the regulators, God's eye view. The IRS is paying private industry to go track down transactions that take money from people now. If you care about KYC, AML, you want identity, go give the identity people a mandate to do it. You have Identity Mine, Accurate, these other companies. You can attach identity to DeFi. You can attach identity to a wallet, to a transaction. You can do these things. You want KYC and AML, tell them how to do it, how you want them to do it. They'll go do it. And you'll make a few billionaires along the way and create a lot of jobs along the way. And those are global credentials. His company can work anywhere. Atala Prism, a product we build for identity, it works in Ethiopia for digital credentials. It's working with Dish, a Fortune 250 company, for Boost Mobile. Same technology, open standard. The W3C came up with 35 companies use. That's the key to this industry.
When you say, regulators, tell them what you want and they'll go do it. Obviously, we've spoken about AML and KYC, but what other areas have we not discussed? Sort of beyond that, should we be thinking about where are there gaps? I'm thinking about things like, wallets and storage, NFTs, Kevin mentioned earlier, listing coins. I don't know if people have thoughts. I know we've gone sort of small, micro, then the big picture, but returning back small again, if people have any thoughts.
Hello everyone. My name is Dr. Marwan Al-Zaroni. I am the CEO of Dubai Blockchain Center. We are an impact business trying to bridge this gap between the industry as well as regulators. We advise the regulators here in Dubai on policy when it comes to the technical side. I'm not a lawyer, but I do advise in a law firm as well. So I have a little bit of fortunate position of being myself in the space since 2012. And there's a lot of hindrances, a lot of annoyances in this space, as you all in this room have experienced in one way or the other. And I think there's a lot of things that can be taken from our experience here in Dubai, is that we tried all the different approaches, right? We tried to talk to the regulators, tried to talk to the central banks. We tried educating the central bank employees, which are at that time, and starting from 2014, were very undereducated around Bitcoin and Ethereum and smart contracts and that kind of stuff. In 2016, just to paint the picture, we started something called the Dubai blockchain strategy, which lasted until 2020. But I would say 99.9% of the use cases were around closed blockchain systems, around Hyperledger and Quorum. So there was not real public blockchains involved in those use cases. But what it did is actually opened our minds to the possibilities of what this technology can do. What we see right now as a challenge is many things. One of the things is that when we talk to the regulators and the different financial centers and the central banks, they try to use analogies. They try to put blockchains within those buckets that we talked about. It is a good thing and a bad thing, but what we didn't anticipate is the length of time it takes to take even a decision on a spot trading kind of regulation. They have to go through, because they actually have to abide by certain laws that are international. They have to go through a certain process, which takes minimal 6 months, but it goes up to a year and beyond. And I think the technology moves much, much faster in this space. So we really need to not only have regulation, but have some kind of a technical enforcement. And I think Charles hit it right on the nail when he said that we need to, manage digital identity, have cryptocurrencies and ecosystems and platforms that have identity and accountability built in. MIT also mentioned that we really need to have a scrutinized look at policies when it comes to smart contract vetting, like Citrix here, for example. Things like rating systems for different platforms and how they wrote the actual architecture for those platforms. And not only from the technical side, but also from the economic side. Like token economics is very important, and a lot of projects do not have token economics that are sound. We do not rate them right now. There is no international standards for rating these token economics. We depend on humans as well. A lot of the people, how many algorithms do you know that rate white papers? It's all done by humans, all open to human interpretation. And all of the people that I know that even in the ICO age were investing based on a hunch or knowing the actual foundational team. They were not looking at it very deeply. We need to have a mix, I think, to regulate this space. We need to have a mix of very good regulators that have deep knowledge. We need to have partnerships with people like Citrix and Chainalysis to really understand how we can actually look at the technical side with technical enforcement, as well as the law side with being compliant with things like FATF rules and KYC-AML, eKYC-AML. Everything that we need is right there on the table. We just need to get everybody together to start step by step, I think, is the right approach with the right partners. And I agree with Kevin that it is a long road. Regulators do not speak the same language, and it's going to be an uphill challenge, but we have to go one step at a time. And Dubai has proven once and again that we can do things differently here. Just give us the chance and really talk to us. We are all ears.
I'd agree this is a very advanced place in terms of enlightenment on this, at least willing to listen, that's for sure. One of the challenges for this jurisdiction, and I'm an investor, and I speak as an investor on this, is if I'm going to invest in let's call it a crypto exchange here, which I'd like to do, I want a federal mandate. I don't want a single emirate mandate. I want a federal mandate because every citizen should be able to trade. And so I would think, we have this challenge in Canada where we have to go to each province to clear, which we did in the case of the license we were granted, the first of its kind in the world, actually. But it had to go province to province to province. I'd really prefer not to have to do this here. So when you think about what you'll offer all of the competitors that would love to license here, because this is going to become the hub of you'll be the London and the New York of the Middle East here if you're enlightened on this. But certainly within this jurisdiction, why do I have to go to each emirate for a license? That makes no sense at all. Someone come up with a federal mandate and make me comply with that. Or, as I'm suggesting, take the Canadian order, which spent 4 years in development, and simply implement that here, because your regulators speak to the Canadian OSC every day, which speaks to the SEC every hour. And why can't we just bring that order here and say, make us comply to this order, which we're already doing successfully in a jurisdiction that has already been achieved success? And that was the same environment that allowed the very first Bitcoin ETF. So I'm pounding the table as a Canadian and an Irishman, and now a golden passport guy, which I really love. That makes the airport so easy. Oh my goodness, what a great idea that was. So I mean, if you can come up with ideas like that, give us a federal mandate here, and let us all pay for that, as opposed to, let's go Dubai, let's go Abu Dhabi, let's go beyond that. I mean, I find that very hard. So I really would like to see some initiative on the federal mandate.
I think the good part is that we're small and we just sit together and we're all WhatsApp away in terms of the federal regulator, the local regulators and so forth. The federal mandate is not something that we say is not on the table, it's there. And the key thing is the federal mandate comes with the local regulators. So where you have maybe, I want to distinguish free zones from mainstream. So if we're looking at in your world, I think definitely at this stage, the new regulator for crypto is, I think what Dr. Sahi was saying was, it's the go-between the federal regulator and the industry. Because the federal regulator was taking a long time to respond, and maybe lack of resource, lack of technical knowledge. So this is the main thing. But anything that comes here will be federal mandate. It would not be local.
Yes, and in the case of VARA, it actually applies to all jurisdictions.
All jurisdictions,
except DIFC. DIFC have British common law, and they have 700 plus banks, and it's going to be a nightmare to regulate that. And I spoke earlier about it taking a long time to speak to them because of the process they have to go to regulate something. That's the only hindrance right here. It is a really long and tiring process.
The challenge is, though, I come here, I invest in the exchange, I start spending a lot of money marketing it to the country, as a country, and there are individuals in Emirates that can't use it, which is inefficient, and it's perverse, it's unfair, and I mean, think about it. That's a complicated situation. Now, it's just an additional pressure on you as regulators, but we're here having this closed session, and I'm complaining.
So I want to clarify. There is a federal mandate with the Securities and Commodities Authority. There is now the independent regulator that works very closely with the federal body to ensure that it is delegated to do the operational side. And
that's in Abu Dhabi.
That is it. That is the new Virtual Asset Regulatory Authority in Dubai.
In Dubai.
In Dubai, which has just recently been formed by law. And with respect to being able to market, there is no restriction neither on marketing nor on participants from throughout the UAE. The point is, where are you actually based, right? So you are based in Dubai, you need a Dubai license. And that's effectively the point. So I think there are nuances there maybe that we can clarify.
Does that mean
for
where
you.
my servers are or where my office is registered?
Where your office is based. Yeah. So I think those nuances we can happily
Can I have two offices?
Clarify to you. You can have 2 officers.
Just in the interest of time, we've only got about 8 minutes left before we're getting turfed out of this room. This is live negotiation and policy making in the room. But I know that, Tim, I think you had something to add earlier.
I did. You know, it's funny. This is awesome. I love this dialogue. It's super elevated. And yeah, I had a tear in my eye, Charles, as well. I think we'll never forget that one. So I appreciate that. You know, it made me think. Back in 2016, I was asked to talk at the President Obama's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology on similar topics. And what's notable, I just thought of it just then. Like back then, everyone was disagreeing. There was a lot of debate and there was a lot of, factions who disagreed. Like the one thing I don't hear here is a lot of disagreement. I hear a lot of different points, but we're all pretty much going in the same direction. Yeah, we can argue and adopt, but by the way, we run the Canadian ETF, so smiley emoji there. But I'd be much smilier emoji if we could do it everywhere else, So I agree, right? We're aligned. I agree with the invalidated assumptions statement, I think, Shira, that you made. Like, well, we're not all agreeing on the same things. We all have to define them. Yeah, we can debate about DeFi. I've got something to say on that in a second. But yeah, we don't really know what that means. Is DeFi even the right thing? We talk about, rather than go through the list I made, the one thing we probably also agree on is that we're going from a place historically that isn't very good. And there are better ways to do the things we need to do. Right? I'm being very basic for a reason because I'm trying to find the common ground that we all have to find in order to put the time and effort in and get those bridges built that get us to the promised land, which in my opinion, it's just mine, is faster, better, cheaper way of doing it for governments, corporations and individuals. So what does that mean? I just stated an objective function, right? It's very broad. Some might argue that it's too broad and you can't really define what it is. But I think you were saying this, Jonathan, I think you were talking about the objective. Like, define what you want to solve first. Now, here's the problem, and I think, Shira, you were mentioning it, like, getting agreement on what we want to solve is nigh on impossible in this world. You're always going to have a Vladimir, aren't you, right? You're always going to have someone who's not going to agree. So let's get practical. How are we going to do this, right? All of this is about, I agree with what everybody said. So I'm sort of sitting here thinking, now, what are we going to do now? I sort of agree, but I'm not getting anywhere fast. So I'm going to throw out a theory. It takes a village theory. And it's based on the following. The Friedman economics that I think built the current primarily dominant capitalist system, the shareholder primacy model and all of that, mostly people don't like that. Right? Again, it's a bold statement. Probably academics would kill me and crucify me for saying it, but I'm trying to be directionally correct. The shareholder...
Just be yourself.
Yeah,
It'll
right?
be easier.
No, you know what I'm saying, right? But we can all get our heads around that. The libertarian ideal that started Bitcoin was somewhat based on that. Maybe it got a little bit twisted in some ways. Some people got way more rich than they should have. That's not the point. The idea is right. The previous model's broken. Is decentralization the answer? Is DeFi the answer? Is that the right objective function? Should we debate how to measure or define decentralization? Or should we actually be creating a democratic future? Should we, you talk in ways that are beautiful because they talk about inclusivity and democracy. So my argument would be the real DeFi should stand up and it's democratized finance. The point is, when you've gone beyond the definition of an objective function and you try to solve it, not everybody's going to agree. Then what? And this is my point. It takes a village. Education. And someone said, education isn't sufficient. Totally agree. But I get asked this all the time. What's the biggest impediment to the development of the ecosystem? And it's very easy to say regulation. It's very easy to hold out the regulators as the problem. But I'm hearing regulators say right here and now that they want to be educated. So education, I've heard people say about practical application, not just talking. So being deliberate about actually doing something. Now that's hard to do in this world, right? Actually saying we're going to put money and time and effort and we're going to put a line in the sand and we're going to generate that outcome that gets us to our objective function. Collaboration, we're not used to it. The old model is very adversarial. Right, we come from a very adversarial financial system. The awesome thing about this new DeFi ecosystem, whether it is decentralized or democratized, is that adversarial thing has gone away in a very big way. We're much more likely to collaborate But PPP was a term that we used a lot in the UK. I'm not sure if it was global. Public-private partnership, remember that sort of concept? What we've heard here is a lot of very smart and accomplished people who deserve to have opinions talk about the importance of public partnership. You're talking about companies in the space need to work together. Public partnerships, government, private partnerships, companies, public partnership, governments working together, that was mentioned, and then public and private working together. Now, do we have the appropriate mechanisms set up to really allow that to happen in the way that it should? I would argue it's still super early. Can we make efforts globally to facilitate that kind of collaboration that leads to the right outcome? That's the it takes a village theory. If it was a tiny little village, you'd all do all of that to make it happen. You'd all agree what you need to solve. And there's always going to be a Vladimir. But the it takes a village theory, I think, is the only way to solve it. We can debate the nuances, but let's work together and get it done. Or maybe I'm smoking too much, Kevin.
So I just came out of a 4-hour, and Richard knows this, a 4-hour heated debate about regulation with a regulator and a head of state. And it does appear, this is coming from someone who's been in the crypto game as long as it's existed and now has transitioned into government. And it does appear, yes, education is a key impediment, but there's enough educational content. It's whether it's being consumed by those who are uneducated. But the regulators are educated at this point in the game. The problem is that you have regulators taking the historical context of what they believe they need to do. And it's from that historical context that they're looking at this through a lens and trying to position blockchain and cryptocurrencies in that old regime, and it simply does not work. The traditional financial market and the conducted activity around that is not the same that we see today. And I don't know if there's ever going to be a solution shy of time going on and these persons leaving their role as regulators. It is a current problem, and one that I am in the mix of as we speak, where we have one of the world's largest blockchain companies trying to work with a regulator, and that regulator is refusing to acknowledge that there is a need to change the model and in many cases cut out the middleman. And it's an ongoing problem that I really don't know what the solution is, shy of those regulators. I don't want to say shy of those regulators not being in those roles anymore.
I think we are about to get chucked out of the room. Thank you for joining us. There's been many valiant speeches. And I guess the takeaway, there's many. I have sort of 10,000 questions that I'm going to have to come to people individually and ask, and I'm sure you all will. But obviously, the it takes a village is a nice note to kind of end on. Here we are. We're trying to do the next step of that. I'm obviously curious what happens with the white paper that comes out of this, and obviously hope that we all sort of take from this and take forth. And thank you, everyone, for being here.